Hello and welcome to Hare in the Hawthorn. My name's Kate Ray, and as always, I'm your host. I have with me my esteemed colleague, Neil Rushton, and we have a very special guest. I'm going to hand you straight over to Neil. I'm going to hold my hands up. He's the one who's invited this guest, and I'm literally going to sit back and really enjoy this. It's going to be a great interview. So hello to both of you, and over to Neil.
Thank you, Kate. Absolutely fantastic. And we are delighted to have David Halpin with us today. And David is a folklorist and a writer. Writes extensively on the folklore of Ireland, and with a special interest in our special interest, which is, of course, the faeries. So, David, if you know, as always, our audience know that we're always tight for time. So we do need to get straight into it. But if you'd like to just give us just a little bit of a 5-minute background to who you are and how you've come to where you are and what you're writing about and speaking about at the present time.
Okay, thanks a million for having me on the show, Kate and Neil. I write about folklore and especially fairy lore, and I've been doing it for a very long time. I suppose my first pieces were published around the mid-1990s, but oddly enough, they were very much in the kind of area of fortean and Irish paranormal. And, you know, it took me a long time to associate fairy lore with that, because we had so many tropes regarding fairies, what they are they little tiny winged creatures, or leprechauns sitting on a pot of gold. And it was only later, I'd say from around the kind of early 2000s and on, that I began to really see that a lot of what we call paranormal occurrences here in Ireland, even going as far as, say, UFO encounters, if you want to label them that way, they had the same kind of motifs that were appearing in fairy lore throughout Irish history. And when I say Irish history, I mean going all the way back to our first kind of writings about these beings, which were kind of around the 6th, 7th century. And they were given a specific identity in writing simply because the first people writing were Christian monks. So they were taking oral traditions and they're putting their own spin on things, but still the kind of the core, what would you say, traits of what these beings are, where we're still coming through. So we had kind of, you know, the people of the hills, people of the mounds, and supposedly they were here in Ireland when the Tuatha Dé Danann arrived. So that's something that's interesting, because a lot of people associate fairies with the Tuatha Dé Danann, and they say that they are them. But if you go into the Irish text, there are actually tantalizing hints about the Tuatha Dé Danann were banished beneath Ireland, and they went to live where the She already were. So whether that's kind of a more animistic nature that was trying to be communicated, or whether that's something else entirely, because fairies are always outside of time anyway. So I found all those things interesting, and I found that they kind of combined very well with my interest in fortean. So I hope that's kind of an answer.
Sorry, Kate.
I've just got extremely excited, because it was around about the early 2000s that I started sort of amalgamating that all of them have these very similar motifs, and actually have discovered as a paranormal investigator myself, going into haunted properties, that a lot of the time when people say demon or poltergeist, and it's like, this is very much fairy behavior, this is, you know, so I'm really excited to hear where we're going to go with this one.
Yeah, well, that's, you know, this perfect little segue into something I saw you post, David, on social media. Very interesting, a little bit cryptic, and I want you to explain what you mean by this. You say, sorry to throw this on you, but you'll know what I mean. So you're talking about Irish fairy lore, how you say how it can be timeless. And this is brilliant. Instead of cutting corners to fit colonial epistemologies, why not include all the peripheral strangeness? Do you want to talk a little bit about what you mean there?
Sure. Okay. Well, I feel that a lot of Irish folklore is very much, because of our own history, we're very protective. And with that protectiveness comes sometimes a closed shop, you know? So we have, say for example, we have a huge collection of folklore from 1938. It's called the Dukas collection, dukas.ie. You can go online and find it. And it was where school children went around the communities and gathered stories from old people so that they wouldn't be lost. So they wrote them all down. So there's certain cultural ideas in Ireland in 1938, like, you know, that's very apparent. But I find that some people want to keep those ideas and bring them as we're moving forward, when in fact there's some parts that need to be left behind because they were of their time. It doesn't mean that we need to kind of dismiss anything that doesn't fit in with what people thought fairies were in 1938. For example, there's in Wentz's book, the Fairy Faith, right? There's a great anecdote about a doctor riding home one night, and he sees these two orbs, and in the orbs are white beings, and then the orbs come together, and the beings move from one orb to another, and then they separate again and move away. Now that, to me, is a classic kind of UFO encounter, except for the fact that we can't even call it UFOs or fairies. There's something else. And it's only when we allow ourselves to say, okay, these labels that we've applied to these experiences need to be discarded in order to see the full picture. But oftentimes I wonder whether we're in the right place yet to get the full picture. I feel that fairy lore is sometimes like putting a DVD into a tape recorder, right? It doesn't work because the tape recorder is not ready for that full information. It seems like there's something there. Okay, it goes in, but it's not ready to receive the full information yet. And that's what I mean about peripheral strangeness, especially in Ireland. There are certain things that fairies do that people kind of discard because it doesn't fit into kind of the typical popular view of a fairy. That's, in a nutshell, what I meant by that, Neil.
That's very interesting. I mean, you know, it's, you and I, David, do tend to sort of come at the subject matter from quite a similar perspective, I think. And what you've just said there really ticks so many boxes. It's, I want to go away and think about it, but I can't because we've got to do the interview with you. But it's so okay. So again, leading on from that, do you think, in terms of the folklore and modern fairy experiences, how important do you think the folklore on places like Dukas or wherever you're collecting it from the past, from that specific historic folklore, I think we've got to understand that folklore before going on to modern fairy experiences. I think a lot of people who are into forteana and paranormal thing, they just want to come straight to the fairies, right? What's happening now? And they don't want to talk about where this tradition has come from and how many hundreds or probably thousands of years it is being with us. But do you want to say something about that? You know, the correlation between the folklore and the modern experiences.
Sure. I think within folklore, we also have the experience of people who are passing on information about what's going on. So, for example, don't go to the stone circle on the equinox at 7 o'clock in the evening. Okay, so we've got a very specific instruction there. And, you know, we have Kirk kind of saying the same thing, then Lang in his introduction saying the same thing. And if we go to any kind of indigenous native culture that still preserves their stories with their own ancestral beings, we call them that for now, it's the same thing. There are certain places that you don't go at certain times, and that's preserved in folklore. Also, what's preserved in folklore are the things that these forms might like or dislike. So there's very important traditions and, again, safeguards maybe that communities have kept in order to live safely alongside the kind of forms that populate their landscape, especially around here. For example, I'm on the Carlow-Wicklow border, and there's particular places here that you can go on to the Dukas archives, but you can talk to people and you can go much further back. And there are certain places where you don't go at certain times. And we have the stories written down. There was one particular story of a woman coming home at night. She heard a sound. Like, first of all, it was like a whip sound. And the next thing she found herself in this place. Now, this is written in 1938, don't forget. So she doesn't have the kind of correlations that we can have in terms of her description. But she says, like, I was in a city that seemed really modern and the people were dressed very finely and it was shining. And then there was another noise, and then she found herself 3 miles away. Okay, so that's preserved in folklore. Also, there's a story of a man walking home from work one night, and he's cutting through a field, and he said he heard music coming from the rath, which is another Irish term for a fairy fort, or it could be actually, like, rats sometimes can describe anything from a dolmen to a stone circle to a fairy fort. Anyway, he said, I heard music coming from the rath, and when I looked, it lit up like a shining palace, and a small man came out and beckoned me inside. I didn't go, and next minute all the lights went out, and in its place was just the fairy fort again. So these are stories preserved in folklore, and we can look at the descriptions that people give us, like, oh, he was just drunk coming home at night, or, you know, he had an overactive imagination, but they parallel experiences that are still happening today, except we have a different context now because we have much more knowledge about technology. So we apply what the sights and sounds are to what we think they may be. So in that way, the folklore is there. It's a guide, isn't it, really, as far as I can see. And of course, there's different types of folklore, but we're focusing here on fairy folklore. But obviously, there are traditions with songs and poems, which are really, really important as well.
There was two things that you've mentioned that I can relate to from, and my ghost hunter friends will relate to as well, which is where I'm at in trying to get people to think around the parameters that things cross over. But you mentioned earlier the two orbs with the figures in them. So orb, emitting light orbs is definitely something which is very well known within the paranormal community in a different way. So there's that motif. And you just mentioned about that whipping sound. That's something that I've experienced before, and it's something that other people who go out and investigate these things, they hear that kind of sound, and it's almost like the whipping of a shift of dimensions, or the shift in air, very, very swift shift in air. So even though fairy folklore and folklore seems like it's something that's not important to us, I think across the communities, you know, it is an important starting point. One thing that I do want to kind of sort of tap you up for a little bit more is you use the term live alongside safely with the fairies. Now, in the UK, we don't have that same sense of safety. We tend to have our fairy gardens and our fairy altars, and we don't have that same ethos, I think, that the Irish do. So from your perspective, what do you mean by live alongside safely?
Well, there are lots of people out there who would kind of say that Irish fairy lore is basically Irish demonology. It's just the term fairy, you know, that's applied to it. And we can come to that kind of whole trope of who the fairies are, and there are so many different explanations. Are they spirits? Are they ancestors? Are they the dead? Are they ultra-terrestrials? Are they something else entirely? One thing that's really interesting from an archaeological perspective is that recently we've discovered evidence that we thought Ireland was populated from around 10,000 BCE. And even that was quite a recent discovery by Dr. Marion Dowd. But now we've found that there were people living in Ireland 33,000 years ago, right? Now, from an animistic point of view, that's really, really important, because do we have this tradition of communication, of give and take, as you say, Kate, living alongside safely? Is it going on that long? Well, maybe that's why we do have a different perspective in terms of what you should and shouldn't do. But to get back to your question, basically there are an awful lot of stories and accounts of people not coming out too well when they have an encounter with a fairy, whether they lose an eye, for example, they may go mad. We have a saying in Ireland, away with the fairies, and it can also mean like someone who has had like an experience where they have the fairy stroke, as it's called, or fairy blast, and something happens. They go somewhere they shouldn't, and they end up psychologically damaged. And this is, there are all kinds of explanations, and anthropologists might say, well, it's just a way of recording mental illness. But there are very specific occasions where people go somewhere and they come back and they say that something happened to them. Now, we do also have, I should say, we do have the same thing as is happening in the UK with fairy doors and that kind of whole pushing fairy lore towards children. And I suppose it's always been that kind of Disney idea of fairies is there. We have Darby O'Gill and the Little People, you know yourself. So that's there. But when you go to the actual folklore, like fairies are not small beings in Irish folklore. They can pass as a human. It's why people tended not to use the term fairies. They would say the good people, because you didn't know whether a person passing by might be a supernatural being. So you have this kind of evidence that people were wary of insulting them, or else maybe saying something that they shouldn't say. But another really interesting thing is, I'm sure you know about the kind of idea of the evil eye. There are stories in the Irish folklore about fairies giving people certain gifts, maybe gifts that they don't want to have. And sometimes it's put forward that maybe it's a way for fairies to kind of enact revenge against maybe a community or something by giving someone this curse. And when they look at someone, then evil befalls them. So I suppose why I would say living alongside safely is we have so many occasions where fairies are not particularly kind, or they have their own motivations. It's probably a better way of putting it. It's a safer way to put it as well, So we don't always know why they do the things that they do.
Definitely, I've come across many cases of malevolent behaviour, modern cases, and people quite often sort of talk to me about the less than benevolent encounters with the fae, and usually you can get to the bottom of the crux of the matter. It's not they don't generally do things just for a whim or a sake of doing it. It is some kind of revenge where they see something morally wrong from their perspective. And I think one of the things that people find difficult, especially about the folklore, is about there is a shift in morality, not only of the age of when that folklore is written and the morality of the time of writing, but also there is a different sort of moral agenda and compass within the fae realm. And I think, that respect thing, I'm hoping that will come back with the renaissance of fairy within our society.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously you both know the Fairy Investigation Society survey that was carried out by Simon Young a few years ago. Most of those encounters are pretty benign.
Yeah.
Not all of them, but the vast majority are pretty benign. Now, I've seen Simon Young, who's put together a new census, and I've seen several dozens of the new encounters, and there are several quite malignant episodes there, which is interesting. Maybe people are starting to be more willing to talk about it.
Well, can I just jump in there, Neil? Because I was thinking about that recently, and I just was I don't know if you know, yesterday was August 15th, which is the feast of the Assumption in Catholicism, and it's where Mary was supposedly taken in body to heaven or the other world. But not many people know that August 15th was originally the feast of Diana. And Diana obviously is a pagan goddess on the same day, and it's the feast where she went to the other world, or whatever the pagan other world is. But it's really interesting that a lot of people, when they're talking about Fatima, describe how the being actually was more reminiscent of Diana than of Mary. And I found that really, really telling. And especially there, as you're talking about, like what their reasons are, because we also have like this form of a bright lady in Ireland, but there's one case in France where she appeared to children and she was beckoning them to kind of walk over the edge of a cliff, and the parents had to go and grab the children. And I wondered, like, is that an act of evil, or is it a case that fairies are outside of time and perhaps the topography changes, and where this being is they're looking at a land that's not in the same physical space as us. So what seems like, because we know, like from fairy lore, that human death often ends up with the person then being seen with the wild hunt or with fairies anyway. So they don't seem to have this kind of end point of physical kind of finality, if you like. So when we impose maybe our own ideas of morality, perhaps there's an actual physical disconnect there between their realm and our realm. It's just an idea.
Mm.
Well, that's well, another perfect segue. You'd think we planned this, but it's so, you know, what are they? You're talking about them being you know, in a different dimension, different time space. You know, this is kind of a big, we know this is kind of a big question at the moment amongst people investigating this phenomenon. What are they? Are they physical? Are they non-physical? Are they a bit of both? Are they living in their own standalone reality while we're not observing them? And are they totally reliant on human consciousness and in their observation? I know that's a massive question, David, and I don't, you know, it's not what I don't really expect a full explicated answer, but what do you think?
Well, I think, like Neil, because I'm like yourself and Kate, and I love this subject, I'm often thinking about it as I'm speaking. So sometimes I don't even know what I'm going to say really. But I thought it was like one thing I was thinking about the other day. It's so interesting, like from an Irish perspective, like fairies begin, if you like, by coming from a hole in the ground, so they're underneath the earth. Then as we moved kind of into modern times, it was like they came from a different dimension. So they came from a hole in space. And now with the more kind of consciousness idea, are they coming from some subterranean realm of the mind? So it's like, you know, they're always kind of moving, depending on their own limited perception that's changing and shifting and growing, I think. We're able to fit them in, or is it the opposite way around, that we're not fitting them in? Like, you know, they're always there, and it's us just having a higher perception. But I think as well, something I wrote about recently was the idea of an observation made by John Keel, where he talks about an object appearing as one thing, as a bright light, for example, and then it tunes down the spectrum as it adjusts to our reality, or is it our reality adjusting to it? And no, he has written like about whether it's kind of the Mothman or UFOs or whatever, but they all seem to have this kind of period of manifestation, you know, that transition. So I think with that, it makes it very hard to answer like what they are or who they are or where they come from, because you would say, okay, if they're listening into our reality, then they're not in our reality. But then, you know, maybe it's a technological thing, some kind of cloaking mechanism. There was in Irish folklore, when the Tuatha Dé Danann were banished beneath Ireland and sent into the mounds to live with the fairies, they had to be taught how to hide themselves from humans. So isn't that amazing? Like, you know, this is a text written around the 7th century or so, where you have that kind of concept, you know, where it's like invisibility to live with humans, but to not be seen by them. And it's not even just to hide from them, to hide when humans are around. It's to walk amongst them and not be seen, you know, or perhaps to fly amongst them, or to move in the orbs. Because in Irish tradition as well, there's a long kind of list of sightings where they move from rath to rath. I know it's not just Ireland, but we actually have written documentation, like from a person living in the remotes of Kerry to people living in Dublin to Northern Ireland or whatever. Like, you know, so we do have that kind of idea that whatever they are, they move at certain times. They manifest as bright lights for certain periods. They take us with them. And as you say, Neil, there are times where someone is taken physically, and then there are times they're here physically, but they're gone mentally. Or sorry, you know, they're gone off into the kind of the realm of fairy consciousness, and they come back and they'll have these stories about timelessness, about things that they can do. Some people come back from the realm of fairy and they have new talents, for example. In Ireland, there's a tradition where if a musician wants to become better or wants to learn a tune that can beguile their audience, they sleep at a fairy fort overnight, and on the equinox or the solstice at certain times of the year, and the fairies will give them a certain gift. But then again, the fairies also say in one account in Dukas, for example, the fairy warns a person that to hear that song is fine, but if you try to play it and it wasn't given to you, we will come for you.
Yep.
So what does that say about them? I don't know. It's a constant process of trying to figure it out, I suppose.
Yeah, I didn't really, if you'd have come up with an absolute answer there, I'd have been astounded, because you'd have been the first person to have ever done it.
Exactly.
Aliens.
They're all aliens. When we'd have been out of a job, we won't be doing this anymore. If somebody comes up with the perfect answer, that's it. That we're shutting down the YouTube. I think that brings us on to the subjects that both Neil and I are quite passionate about. And you were talking about certain times in certain places, and those certain times holding an energy, but there are also certain places on the planet that hold a certain energy. Again, that knowledge seems to be part of our culture. And we seem to be reviving that through neo-paganism and paganistic practices. Why do you think that there are specific places and specific times that either give us a doorway in terms of perception, or give them a doorway in terms of an energy to be able to interact with us in a level that they don't usually?
The answer I can only really guess at, but sometimes I feel like they're like these cogs. Do you remember that game years ago? I think it was Downfall or something.
Mm-hmm, it was
the counter in, and you turned it, and at certain times, if the cogs were in a certain kind of placement, you could slip through. The counter could slip through, and I think we have all these kind of wheels within wheels of these ecologies of consciousness as well, because I think it's very much to do with the mind. I think perception is not just a case of being able to see or experience something, but I think perception is connective, if that makes sense. And there's actually a good example of that within fairy lore, because we have stories in Ireland of fairies playing hurling, okay? But for some reason, they need to be observed by a human before the game can begin.
Yeah.
And I often wondered if there's some kind of quantum entanglement thing here, like a particle or a wave. By being observed, then they can act. But by not being observed, they can't act.
I'd never thought of that. That's so interesting, that Hurley story where exactly, they need to be watched. Do you think that's an embedded clue within the folklore about what they are?
Perhaps it's a time embedded clue, because only by us understanding quantum mechanics could we actually make that distinction and put that idea forward. So it's like it's time locked, So perhaps as well, like so something we have to maybe think about is there's loads more of other time locked clues, and 100 years from now we'll know something else about physics, and when we look back on folklore, we'd say, "Oh my God, look, that's written.
It's all there.
It's just written in such a way that we couldn't understand it at the time." So perhaps it is a clue, Neil. Yeah.
I mean, maybe it's as simple and as complex as if the theories of the holographic universe are to be believed, that those points in time and those places in time actually give us a conscious thought point, something to focus on. And because we're all doing it at the same time, at the same place, so with a rise in sort of more ancient religions, that we are more aligned with that energy, that certain places and certain times, because we're putting in that much, that we are literally the cogs, that we're imprinting on that holographic universe to bring these things into existence. So very simple, as I've said it, but very complex as an idea. And I don't understand the physics or the quantum physics about it, but maybe that's a starting point.
Well, it could well be. In Irish Banshee tradition, for example, the Banshee comes to a certain family. Yeah. But what and she kind of she's known as kind of someone that's going to bring. It's not that she kills anyone, but she warns that a death is coming or something like that, right? she talks about families in the past because she's associated with them. But what I always find really interesting is that she talks about the families still to come in the future.
Yeah.
You know, she'll talk about something that's going to happen 2 generations from now. So it's like she's outside time. And there are some French medieval texts that talk about fairies, and in them, the fairy, there's one particular text, I think it's called the Knight of Staffenburg. I could be wrong with that, but the fairy says, where I want to be, I am, and where I'm not, I am there too. So something to that effect. And as you say, Kate, it's very holographic. It's very like, you know, I'm in this place, but I'm also everywhere else.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, so but I find it kind of ominous as well, because it's like, oh right, okay, then there's no escaping. And oddly enough, as you mentioned, Michael Talbot there and the holographic universe. He has a fiction book called The Delicate Dependency, and it's really, really good. It's well worth checking out because it's about vampires, but the vampires are more like fairies, and they have this kind of way of being able to sense anything that happens at a certain place at any time. It's just it's worth checking out.
Brilliant. Talking about books, I know I can't believe the time, but we are literally down to 5 minutes, and I know Neil wants to introduce some of your work. I know I've read one of your books which Neil recommended, so I'm going to pass over to Neil to introduce some of your work and then get you to talk about where we can find your social media, etc.
Well, of course, what we really need, the way I found David in the first place was his fabulous Facebook site called or group called Circle Stories. And where David, I have to say, David, you are so prolific in writing. It's just, you know, it terrifies me. So, you know, very briefly, before we talk quickly about your 2 novels, Circle Stories, why are you writing it? Why is it important? What do you do on it?
Well, it's very odd, Neil, because I was writing writing book reviews for a while for different magazines and so on. And stories, because I just wanted to approach Irish folk from a consciousness and more esoteric perspective, because I felt that there are people out there, very good people out there doing something similar, but I felt that I had a particular thing that I wanted to kind of get at. You know, I wanted to kind of open up folklore a little bit and kind of show people that it's not just something that belongs in the past, that it's a living tradition, and so is our fairy lore a living tradition. And it was awkward at first because the term fairy tends to put people off and they don't know what they're getting into. But I do find that a lot of people read my articles and I hope they're quite expansive. I hope like I bring in writers and thinkers like Folklore, for example, and people that kind of have a much broader view. I didn't really see that in Irish folklore. So that's kind of why. And it's just, you know, certain things I tried don't work, and then this, for whatever happened, for whatever reason, Circle Stories has taken off, and it's been really, really good. I've met some great people like yourselves, and it's hopefully something that will continue.
It really is a fantastic resource. You're a great writer. I'm not just saying that. You're a great writer. You articulate things brilliantly, and I think, you know, if I know we're running short of time. You know, where do we find you? I think the best place to find David is go to Circle Stories on Facebook, and you will be amazed. There's a massive big archive there. You can just, you know, fill your boots in what David's talking about. So before we finish, we do need to mention that you are also a novelist. 2 books.
Yeah, I've written 2 novels, a book of short stories, a few plays as well, which I've been lucky enough to kind of have professionally produced. Unfortunately, COVID put paid to my kind of full-length play, which I had hoped would go on a bit of a run. So we'll see what happens. Yeah, novels. It's just another way to explore kind of these concepts, and it allows me to kind of go a bit further, perhaps, and to imagine a bit more. Yep. So that's why. But,
yep. So again, they're easily found, you know, all good bookstores, and some not so good bookstores. That's one of them. That's brilliant. I've just finished that one, and the other one I've only got on Kindle, which is The Girl Who Spoke to the Wind, which it's more of it's a novella, really, isn't it? It's not massive, long, so you can read it.
I love that. There was something so poetic and something so
Yes,
gentle but slightly disturbing, not disturbing but slightly edgy about it, that kind of, I didn't know which way it was going to go. It was lovely. It was lovely. It reminded me very much how stories affected me as a kid, of just being a little bit nervous about where this was going, but also enjoying the beauty of it. So yeah, that was lovely. Then Neil put me onto that, so thanks Neil. Anyway, we have literally run out of time. We're down to 1 minute, and I'm going to get cut off like I usually am, rambling on my last little spiel. So I want to thank you so much, David, for coming along, and I'm sure if you don't mind, we'll get you back later on in the year to sit and have a chat. Hopefully we might be rich by then, and we can upgrade our Zoom to, you know, hours and hours and hours of talking to our guests and keep them for days chatting. I've done pretty well keeping my mouth shut. This is usually where it kicks me off. So thank you so much, David, for your time, and thank you for sitting with me again, Neil. I don't know why you put up with it, but you're brilliant as a co-host. So thank you very much, guys. I will drop a link down below of details of how to get hold of David on social media, and also a few bits about his recent writing. So thank you very much, guys.
Thanks very much for having me.
Fantastic. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.